Hi, all. I just want to first say it's an honor to be surrounded by so many badass women in this panel. I'm just like really excited by that. But we're going to be talking kind of dialectically between our both shared interests of looking and building for more just futures, the climate crisis at the wild-urban interface. We also absolutely want to, of course, start talking about like the land that we're currently residing on. This is the Nimiku land, or the Nez Perce tribe, the Palouse, the Chichemesh, the Coeur d'Alene people. We are so deeply thankful and extend gratitude to these communities, but also further than that, we really want to go beyond that of trying to incorporate knowledge systems and learning from the knowledge that they're actively producing on this landscape, and trying to think about critically the ways in which white settlers have changed the knowledge systems of the land and how we're in the current situation that we currently are in. And we also wanted to introduce ourselves and our connection to fire and fire towers. So my name's Nick. I grew up in Kentucky to a firefighter family. My dad was an urban firefighter. So my relationship to fire growing up was very different than what it is in the West, especially in wildland firefighting. And I think that's where I really got to learn how to like respect fire and really understand its power in an urban setting. Yeah.
And my origin story with fire, I'm also an East Coaster. I'm from North Carolina. And I'm also a trail runner, just like you see in this landscape. And I used to do this race in upstate New York where you started at the bottom at Stratton Mountain and ended at the Stratton fire tower at the top. So it was a really interesting intersection of, I guess, like hiking, running, and fire towers.
Yeah, it was when I was growing up, my dad we would hunt fire towers in the east, not in the west, of course, but in like Indiana and Kentucky. But this is probably what we wanted to talk about. First, we're going to just toss it back and forth. So I'm going to talk about the climate crisis. Emily's going to talk about fire barracks. I'm going to talk about responding to Emily's, and then Emily's going to kind of give us updates on it, and then we're going to kind of close in reflection, piecing our kind of conversations together. So first, this is from the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Impact Assessment that they just produced a few years ago in 2021. And they're currently working on a climate action plan. It's very common to see an impacts assessment followed by a climate action plan, just so you can make the groundwork. This is one of my favorite graphics in their entire report. It is the observed and projected temperature change specifically for Idaho under current climatological conditions. And it's also one of my favorite parts is it's in Fahrenheit. Mainly because my students that I teach on campus don't know Celsius. You can say we've had 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming since the pre-industrial levels, but that means nothing to them, right? So when you say 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, they feel that texture a lot more. And when you say in a middle emission scenario that Idaho is going to increase by 7.5 degrees Fahrenheit, that really feels like something to them, right? If you talk about the heat dome event in 2021 being around like a 105 temperature and going up to 115, 120, 130 in northern Idaho, that is staunchly different, right? We're talking about a pretty hot day to a completely unlivable, unfarmable, and unmanageable ecosystem by the end of the century. Really just like grounding us in the climate crisis that we're in and will going to experience. Further, this is from the City of Moscow's report. This is the number of annual extreme, quote unquote, fire days, danger days. And Moscow, this is a bit of a higher emission scenarios, but historically, Moscow was looking between 10 to 15 extreme dangerous fire days. And then by the mid-century, 2050 roughly, we could see anywhere between 20 to up to 40 extreme fire days in Moscow, Idaho specifically. And I think last year was a test. This report was made a few years ago, but I think it's a testament to looking at the fire that was just east of Rosars even just last year and seeing how fire is starting to encroach on the urban landscape. I think even more, we can show graphs all day long, but when you put it pretty simply in a sentence, the annual area is expected to increase by a factor of 10 by 2050 in northern Idaho specifically. So we're just talking about a massive amount of land that's going to be burning as well. This all kind of concludes with this feedback loop that we're seeing, right? Feedback loops are where the initial conditions cause a change in the initial conditions, right? With fire in the landscape and climate change specifically, we're seeing the initial conditions of increasing temperatures because of greenhouse gas emissions from mostly industrialized urban global north countries, leading to increased temperatures, drier forest burning, releasing of emissions, which then increases the conditions that we started with, right? So it's a positive feedback loop in that sense. And this is mainly in the North American context, in the US context, mainly because of the fire policies that were implemented. Thank you, Penny, for laying so much foundation. So we don't really have to, is we had the 10 a.m. policy, right, where you had to put out a fire immediately, but it built up this massive fuel loads, then starting to move away from the 10 a.m. policy towards the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and now currently the comprehensive strategy that the US Forest Service has. And I just want to quickly read this quote. Stephen Pine posits, we can't cut away our way out of the problem. We can't burn our way out of the problem. We can't simply suppress and we can't walk away, but maybe we can cut a little, burn a little, suppress a little, and sometimes just back off from a fire that we can't hope to stop. The process will take decades, not years, but taken together, a lot of small steps can make a big difference. I think that really sums up the shift in federal policy. I'm going to toss it to Emily now.
So I'm currently working on a project at the El Portal entrance of Yosemite National Park. This is a project with the National Park Service, and it's a internal team at AECOM. So engineers and architects are all working together for this project internally. And I'm working on it with a coworker of mine, Drew Allen. It's a 2-story firefighter barracks that house 23 seasonal firefighters. And these are rotating firefighters up here. So groups of like 10 to 15 firefighters will stay here at a time for a couple of weeks. It's mostly maintenance-based work. And it's around 9,000 gross square foot building. So the first question is, why are they building it here and why are they building it now? And that's because instances of wildfire in this area, this is Yosemite National Parks, have greatly increased since the 1930s. And these red dots here are instances that just happened in 2024. There are 2 fire lookouts in Yosemite National Park. One of them was built in 1931, and the other one was built in 1950. And that's because the federal policy used to be the 10 a.m. policy, which was very suppression based. And fire lookouts, because of that, have a lineage of surveillance and immediate suppression for fires. But now the 2017 Yosemite Fire and Forest Management Plan is now incorporating what Indigenous people have known for a very long time, which is that controlled burning, cool burning, cultural burning has a positive impact on the landscape and the fire mosaic landscape of the region. And so now the National Park Service is pivoting towards a more prescribed fire and mechanical binning policy, where firefighters throughout the year are literally going into areas, pulling brush and undergrowth to try to reduce that fuel load that has built up very drastically throughout the years.
Great. So Emily and I are like friends outside of like kind of this setting, and the kind of impetus for this project was I had her guest speak in my class last year, and then last semester when I was teaching a bunch of undergrads. And when she was presenting, I was co-teaching her classes, 88 students, climate science in person, and then I had 19 students who were incarcerated. And that's what a lot of my dissertation is looking at. It's called The Missing Ring. And I'll be defending hopefully in 2 weeks. But that's all to say, I'm trying to figure out what stories are outside of the dominant discourse, both in treating sciences as well as climate sciences. So when I think about Emily's work, I'm thinking about who's going to be living there, right? Who are these designs for? Of course, they're for the park, they're for fire suppression or fire management, pardon. But when we look at the vast number of people that are incarcerated in the US, it is one of the most common households in the US. It's the 8th most common household, right? 2 parents, 2 kids, for example. The incarcerated individual is the 8th most common makeup of the household in the US, with millions of people in the US currently incarcerated, and weirdly being from Kentucky and Idaho, they actually go back and forth with being the highest per capita states of who's most incarcerated, which is hard for me to wrap my head around. So this is why something I deeply care about is the incarcerated voice within the landscapes, especially around prison labor specifically. Around 70% of people in state prisons have to work, getting paid. I'll show the stats later, and then there's 29% who choose to work. We can flip that as well. 39% of incarcerated workers are paid nothing for their work, and 61% are paid like abysmal, basically not working. That wages can be mapped onto here. It's either 0 cents with the darkest blue, and then the highest rates are 35 cents an hour. So just to like set the context of how much folks are paid in these settings. But when it comes to fire jobs make up a huge part of prison labor, and they're actually paid more. So they're highly desired jobs. For example, when we look at how much they're paid per day, you get paid $10 a day for being an incarcerated firefighter, with an additional $1 per hour for emergencies. So for the LA fires specifically, there was about 1,000 incarcerated people who were helping with the LA fires. And when we look at the state of California, where Emily's working, the state of California saves around $90 to $1 million per year for using incarcerated labor for wildland firefighting rather than using union jobs. In the total number of wildland firefighters in California, it fluctuates throughout the year, of course, but it can reach up to 30% of the entire workforce of the state of California is incarcerated labor. So it's not just a little number. This is a massive number of people who are managing the landscapes, who are also, after working in fires, go back to some of the most climate vulnerable situations in the US currently for the climate crisis wildland firefighter, right? We think about homebound people, people who depend on energy, that might experience blackouts, and then people who literally cannot decide to leave an area. And this is where I want to tie it back into the fire tower kind of concept, is thinking about the panopticon of this parallel natures in which fire towers resemble panopticonic prison surveillance and kind of have similar legacies in terms of their development historically in the early 1900s. And then being used in prisons as well, and how they surveil the landscape. Well, one might be for suppressing fires, the other one might be for suppressing people, right? And at this point, I really want to, this is more of like kind of provocation and thinking about who's staying in the structures that she's building, is pulling from Audre Lorde, is thinking about what does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy. It means that only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and lawful. I think that when we hold this intention with fire towers, it can really provide a lot of conversation looking forward. I'll check it back for
So the project is at the base of El Cortal, which is in a valley. It's the El Rancheria Valley. The site is here, and it's a site that's not only very scenic, but also marketed by some very, very narrow roads. So I don't know if anyone's ever been there. It's super windy. It's hard to get in. Sometimes it takes hours. And if the road shuts down, it's like nearly impossible to get to. It's also a very housing scarce region. So the reason that they're building the barracks here in this particular neighborhood and area is because there isn't enough housing for this personnel to live anywhere in the area. And there's not even a hotel in which they could stay in. And this also provides some constraints for the building of the project because there's actually not enough housing for construction workers to stay there while they're building the project also. And this area is also a Mission 66 region. So it's a historical preservation site. Mission 66 was actually designed by Thomas Charles Bint, who was a landscape architect for the National Park Service, who basically put together the aesthetic for all these fire towers that now became the basis of the Mission 66 model. So this is called the rustic Yosemite fire tower. And so in building this, we had to maintain the historical integrity of this neighborhood, which is characterized by these one-story, very horizontal California ranch style homes, mostly stucco with sometimes clay tile roofs. But because of the very restrictive nature of the housing in this area, we couldn't use a traditional construction model because there isn't enough housing for the construction workers to live there. It's also just really hard to get materials there. So similar to a fire tower, you're dealing with restraints of like how much people can carry and the loads and seasonality of the building process. So we had to look at a prefabricated building module structure. So this is the floor plan of what became the building. It's constructed of this like red area is one module. So there's 6 modules within the structure, and then it's basically like connected on site. So it's fabricated or would be fabricated in California. So it becomes a more kind of like hyper local construction model too, because all of your materials are coming more locally. There's also a much higher tolerance for the building and waste management of the build. So you use less material. Then it's transported. The reason it's a 60-foot module is because that's what can be legally pooled in a truck. And then field installed, that can actually take a week or less, because you're basically almost like Lego building this. And then the assembly on site can come together really quickly. And this does have a lot of similarity into the way that fire towers are built. You're limited in the amount of load that you can carry up the mountain. They're modular because they can be replicable. And the idea that the National Park Service was really excited about is because there's going to be a need, an increasing need for firefighter barracks in the region. They want to use this as a typology that they can repeat in different neighborhoods throughout Yosemite eventually. And in the design of this, one of the very key factors when we were talking to the firefighters is culturally the kitchen and the communal spaces are really important. So they actually didn't really care about the sleeping quarters at all. They're like, you make that as small as possible. We're currently living in our cars, so it's not a big deal to us, but we really want a big communal kitchen where we can all cook together. And then one of the other constraints that they're really excited about is the possibility of having some kind of covered outdoor space that connects to the landscape. This is the second floor. Another priority to them was that the two floors kind of operate separately mechanically, so they can be shut down during parts of the season if there's only one crew there at a time. And then the historical preservation aspect really came through with the material usage. It's a two-story building, which is highly unusual for this area. So there's a lot of concerns of it needed to meld into the landscape. And we really wanted to emphasize the horizontality with these covered spaces throughout the structure. So that's what the elevations look like. You're going to see like some slight variations in the two. These are two different design options. They eventually went with this one. But this structure is a elementary school that's right adjacent to the site that historical preservationists were really pushing for. It has a very kind of a departure from the Mission 66, which was kind of ironic. But we pulled a lot of the like CMU material and then the horizontality from the roofs, and the roof is offset, similar to this elementary school. And then obviously, because it's a firefighter barracks, we had to think a lot about the structure and how the structure would fare in a fire condition. So we first looked at this with landscape zones. So there are 3 different landscape zones that kind of define the defensibility of the space. And actually a lot of that has to do with this very strategically placed parking lot, which is an asphalt parking lot that kind of protects the structure and the front side. And then the other piece of this was the use of fire resistant materials. So we're using a metal seamed roof. And instead of a typical timber construction, we're looking at the steel construction building, which is also helpful, the prefabrication process. And then stucco is also a naturally fire resistant material. And then we also wrapped this 8x8 block base around the bottom as an extra layer of defensibility. It also helps with the snow and as things are de-iced in the area. But then we also wanted to kind of push back on this model and think about where it starts to break down. So this is a push by the National Park Service to be more proactive in the way that the Yosemite National Park is managed from forest and fire perspective. But also this project costs $3 million. And how many firefighters could you employ to be on the ground doing preventative work instead of using something like this model? It's also highly reactive in the way that you're putting a lot of money into the building, so then the structure itself needs to be highly defensible to fire. But then what if it was a much cheaper construction and you just let it burn and then you rebuilt it? Is that like a better model?
And then I just want to add to that, I see a parallel of like this proactive design, reactive design is so similar to climate adaptation, which is adapting to the changes, or climate mitigation, which is trying to mitigate the future changes. And hopefully trying to find that overlap is where the resiliency really builds in, of like, how can we have resilient design and also resilient strategies to cope with climate change?
Thank you very much.
Wow.